Welcome to Chalk and Talk, a podcast about education and math. I'm Stokke, a math professor and your host. Welcome back to another episode of Chalk and Talk. My guest in this episode is Bruno Reddy, CEO and founder of Math Circle, best known for creating times tables rockstars and numbots. We talked about his journey from founding a school to creating times tables rockstars, which grew out of a need to boost students' basic math skills. Bruno shares some great ideas on how to generate excitement in the math classroom and to motivate students to practice those foundational math skills that are so essential for future success. We also discuss the importance of math fluency, his observations from a teacher exchange in Shanghai, and effective teaching practices like mastery learning and variation theory. If you've never heard of variation theory, you'll want to stick around for that. It's a great way to structure practice so that students experience success at every step. Bruno's approach to teaching strikes a powerful balance between structured practice and making math feel fun and accessible. It's an energizing conversation full of practical ideas for anyone passionate about improving math outcomes. I hope you enjoy the episode. Times Tables Rockstars will be running national and regional competitions in New Zealand and Australia in August, September, and October. It's a great way to get students excited about practicing times tables. Follow their socials on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. I'll provide a link in the show notes. If you're enjoying Chalk and Talk, you might want to check out another podcast I've been enjoying lately. It's called Teachers Talk Radio. They've got a network of around 30 teacher hosts, and they publish shows daily on all the usual platforms like Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. They cover anything you could imagine that's teacher-related. Recently, I listened to Tom Rogers interview Daisy Christodoulou about AI and assessment. It was a great episode, and I learned a lot from it. So give them a follow wherever you get your podcasts or visit them at ttradio.org. That's Teachers Talk Radio. Now, without further ado, let's get started. I am really excited because I have a times table rock star joining me today. I've got Bruno Reddy joining me from England, and he is CEO and founder of Math Circle, and that's known for times table rock stars and numbots. He co-founded King Solomon Academy, which is a secondary school in London where he was head of maths. He has an MSc and a BSc in psychology from the University of Sheffield, and he has an honorary doctorate in education from the University of Bedfordshire. He is also an officer of the Order of the British Empire. Congratulations. So I'm excited to hear all about your work today and to get some great tips for teaching math. Welcome, Bruno. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Anna. This is a real privilege. I remember when we met at Research Ed Toronto last year, we talked about this, but you and I have known each other for a while. I've been listening to your podcast for even longer. So yeah, this is just like a crazy, happy turn of events for me. I'm really chuffed to be here today.
And I bet I've known about your work longer than you've known about mine, because we actually use times table rockstars in the after school program that I run. And we've been using it actually for quite a few years. And so I came across it, I think, on social media. And I was looking for something that particularly we could send the kids home with to practice their times tables. And it was perfect. I actually want to tell the listeners, I don't normally wish we had video, but today I kind of do, because you've got to see the background of the room Bruno's in, because he's got rock stars and robots and all sorts of cool murals in the background. And I just thought of some great ideas for painting my own office. So anyway, let's start from the beginning. So what led you to create Times Table Rockstars? Is it Times Tables Rockstars or Times Table Rockstars?
Plural of times tables rockstars, yeah. So this all started in my classroom as a high school, as a secondary school math teacher. I was in charge of maths in the school because I was head of department. It was a school that I helped to found, to create from the ground up. It was a school that we based largely on the charter model of schools in the US. And before we opened up this school in London, we visited schools in Houston, New York, Boston, and so on. And some of the high achieving, high performing schools that were in educationally disadvantaged areas. And we figured, well, look, they've created a playbook for success and turnaround schools that defy the zip code statistics. And we thought we were compelled, after our own experience in the classroom, to do something in London. So we created this school. I taught maths for a year as the head of maths, realized that the students were not on track at that point for college. And we might come on to talk about one of the other reasons why they turned out not to be on track. But one of the fundamental reasons was that I was continuing in vain to teach them things like simplifying fractions, simplifying ratios, solving basic algebraic equations without the requisite skills, without the kind of the recall of the tables, without the tables at the tip of their tongue. It just meant that basic instruction at the whiteboard, at their table, helping them out, a lot of their minds and their thought processes were caught up in the calculations. And it really struck home when I looked at the syllabus that I still had to teach them for another 4 years, and sort of started doing like a root analysis of tracking back to the kind of the most basic maths in all of these things that I've got to teach them. How many of those had a root back in multiplication and division? That is to say, like there's a lot of what we're teaching in England in maths up to the age of 16 and beyond that fundamentally you're going to really benefit from knowing your times tables in order to do well, in order to not struggle to kind of take on what sits on top, as I call it. So it was at this point when I was thinking, right, what am I going to do with the next cohort of year 7? So this would be grade 6. And it was when we had a colleague of mine from America, from New York. She used to teach at a Knowledge is Power program school, as a KIPP school in New York. And she called me a rock star for washing up the mugs in the staff room when I wasn't on the rota. It was simple as that. And I felt so warm inside when she called me a rock star. No one's ever called me a rock star, right? And it was like, oh, that's a really cool feeling. It was really basic. Sorry, I'm a simple person. And I thought, right, maybe my students could feel like that too. And I used this idea of being a rock star as a metaphor for being great at something, trying hard, excelling, success in some way, however you want to define success, a feeling at least. And so I went home and I thought, right, I'm going to have to look for something to fill this gap. And I looked around, and all the other programs for times tables and multiplication division practice, they just seemed to be trying to do it with a really brute force approach. And I kind of tried to call on my years of doing psychology and knowing children a bit and knowing maths a bit to see if there wasn't like a more pedagogically sound way, like a more structured way to approach the tables, a way that was going to maybe fit in with my intuitive understanding of cognitive science. No one was really talking about cognitive load, particularly in 15 years ago. Fortunately, I'd come across it in my degree, and I couldn't really find anything that really fit the bill. So I put these two things together, multiple things together, being called a rock star, having a times tables problem, not being able to find a solution, and just thought, right, I'm going to just have to make this myself. And so I sat down with Microsoft Excel and programmed out a set of workbooks that would take the students on a structured, careful, pedagogical journey through the tables, layered on with a rockstar theme. So rockstar status according to how accurate and rapid they were being, a sort of system of like putting posters and certificates up on the walls to kind of acknowledge how well they were doing. Just like make them feel great about it, essentially, and get them to feel great about it quite soon. And then just keep reinforcing that greatness. It kind of went from there. Like I was not expecting to be where I am today, like literally recording a podcast with you when I was back then in the classroom. That was none of what I'm doing now is necessarily planned out. It's all very like organic and spontaneous. And that's kind of how it was back 15 years ago when I made it. I wasn't anticipating this, but it's become something because I think a lot of other educators share the same problem, experience the same problem with their students, not knowing the tables. And they kind of think, well, we need something. We've got to crack this nut. We can't just keep going on like this. And so I'm grateful to all the educators, you included, Anna, who have tried it out and are using it with their students to great effect.
It started off with, it's a common refrain. You're teaching a later grade and you're trying to teach someone something and they don't have the prerequisite skills. And this often does boiled down to multiplication and division, as you said. You started the program and it was kind of like a worksheet program to begin with. Am I right?
Yes.
And you still have the worksheets. Like we use those worksheets, for the timed practice portion. But now it's also like there's an online version.
Now there's an online version. So the offline versions, the worksheets, I think they do a great job of building up a routine at the start of every math lesson. Teachers love it. I love it for that consistency. It gets that buzz going right at the beginning. And I was playing rock music at the time, and it's all just about being fun and a bit silly. But then 3 years into doing this with successive groups of grade sixes, year sevens, one of them said to me while he was on another math website on the Chromebooks, "Hey, sir, this would be, we like rock stars. We did it on paper at the moment. It'd be fun to do it online." And I thought, you know what, Sonny? And that was his actual name, Sonny. That's a really good idea. So I spent the summer, I found and paid for with my teacher salary, a couple of people, one who could do the drawing, one who could do the coding. And we got an online version out there. And that's when I started offering it to other schools. And then that's when it started becoming something.
I remember watching like a little video that came with the program, and you were wearing a wig. You maybe even had a guitar. But now, like in the online program, the kids get an avatar and they can purchase things for the avatar, clothing and musical instruments and things like that, right?
That's it. And it was that rockstar theme that started off strong at the beginning and continues to be like at the center part of it. So that night when I said I went home and I tried to figure this thing out in Excel, I also went onto Amazon and bought myself a purple and black wig. That became like my look. And in fact, if video was switched on for the viewers or the listeners, what you would see is this character painted on the wall, who's my rock alter ego. This character on the wall is called Baz Winter. That's me. That's my rock persona with the purple and black hair. And I'm never more than 2 meters away from my wig. It's literally just like within arm's reach, so that at a moment's notice, I'm ready to transform into Baz Winter. And the students have their own rock alter ego themselves. The first time they log in, they choose a rock name. That often can take a bit of time to land on a rock name that you really identify with. And then you've got your avatar, and your avatar is kind of your character. It also kind of anonymizes you so that when you're in these multiplayer races, your real name doesn't come up, your location and everything doesn't come up. There's no photo, whatever. It's your little caricature and your rock name that gets displayed. So that just provides a sort of a safety level, not just in terms of digital safety, but just sometimes in terms of like emotional safety. The students don't necessarily want to be out there, even within their own class or their own school, known for how they're doing at the times tables.
Absolutely. But some kids actually do really like competition.
Love it. Absolutely thrive on it.
So you can set it up so that your students are just practicing specific tables. You can set it up so, and they can go into, I can't remember now, it's like the garage, right? Where they're practicing, and then there's the arena.
So the garage is where we use the tech to do what tech should do, which is to personalize the questions. So almost in real time, it's choosing the right questions for each student based on their prior knowledge and what it can see where the weaknesses are. So we programmed it with kind of like the order of the tables, what's more important, the weighting, and so on. And it only works with the 6 questions at a time, 6 multiplication questions, and their twin division questions. So we always do multiplication and division in tandem. We're trying to do just a few facts at a time to kind of keep within cognitive limits. And that seems to go well. And that's where we get that early success of students thinking, oh, wow, okay, I could do those questions. And then it just naturally releases into the pool the next couple of questions, almost pretty much without them noticing. So the difficulty level just always feels very natural to them. It never really gets beyond their reach. And again, I think that's maybe what tech should be being used for and doing it well. So teachers don't really have to set anything because our system is actually going to do it much better than a human can.
And I remember trying this and competing in the arena myself because it's kind of addictive, especially if you know your times tables. You kind of want to compete. It's fun.
So we've got the arena games for students to compete against their own classmates, which just adds a bit of local excitement. Then we've got the global ones where they can race against anybody who's online around the world. And in fact, we've just finished a few hours ago competitions in 5 states of Australia, New South Wales and Victoria and so on. So they've been competing for statewide glory. And then we've got national competitions coming up in New Zealand, in Australia, Wales and Ireland and so on.
Wow. So you actually have competitions that you set up.
They add a different element. So it's less about your own personal success in those and more about joint success with your class. So students are kind of almost collaborating for the greater good and seeing that as their goal, that as their mission today or this week, is to support my class in being the best class in the school, the best class in the state, the best class in the country. Hopefully something for everyone. The ones who are more apprehensive about their skill set, doesn't really matter, because as long as they're trying, they're working towards that common goal, which they love.
So do you have any data or evidence of long-term improvements in math outcomes for students using TTRS?
I can definitely point to the school where I was at, where Rockstars was created, to King Solomon Academy, where the first cohort students didn't have Rockstars and the second cohort onwards did. And there are noticeable differences in their outcomes when they got to 16 in terms of their GCSE math scores. We were 7th in the country in terms of those outcomes as a school with our first cohort, but we were 1st in the country with our second cohort. There's a correlation. I can't say fully that it's causation. There are many other elements, but there was a stark difference in outcomes. And of course, we've got over 1 million students using Rockstars every week. 1 million different students a week using Rockstars. All those students are on there for a reason, which is to support them greater maths confidence and maths understanding. And schools wouldn't be using it in such numbers if they weren't seeing it, right? If they weren't noticing the results, not only in those raw skills, but I'm really happy to say in confidence too. That is the underlying maths confidence, that we can really build that up, that resilience, so that when the maths gets tougher, they stick with it, so they understand that actually I can get knocked down, but I can also get back up again. That for me is part of the win of any intervention or any program, is to build the maths confidence.
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge part of being able to succeed in math. I think a lot of times just those sort of basic skills, actually, when you don't have them, it really can hold you back and actually hurt your confidence. So what you're doing is awesome.
Thank you. I mean, I liken it to learning a sport or a musical instrument. If you were getting frustrated that you weren't picking up on this skill that your coach was trying to show you, it would get a little bit tough and demoralizing. You'd be like, I'm not really enjoying this because I just can't quite get it. And so I'm sure it's got to be, someone will tell me that, no, that's not a valid parallel, but I think it's a perfectly valid parallel. Like just that feeling of you're being shown something, you're not quite getting it. Well, that's because we haven't learned or figured out the underlying skill. And I think it's just a matter of time. I think everybody can learn the tables. For me, it's not a question if they can or can't. Of course they can. It's going to be time, and maybe it's going to be about how they do it. We might have to have one or two different approaches at the extreme ends. I think by and large, everyone kind of falls within a group where they're going to be able to learn them in more or less the same way and get on with them. At extreme ends, we're going to have to maybe think about how we do something different for those cases.
We've talked a lot on the podcast about methods for building fluency with times tables. That's come up a lot because I do realize that it's a big problem. And I think it's an important problem that has to be addressed. But something I'd like to talk about with you, because I think this is something you're really good at, and that's motivation. So I'm hoping we can talk about motivation and, strategies maybe that you've used to motivate kids to practice times tables or do math in general. I mean, I even heard you talk about hiring a limo and picking up the kids or something like this. So I'd really love it if you could talk about this, like if you're using rewards-based strategies or that sort of thing.
Look, I don't dangle limo rides in front of kids to get them to practice just so I can be on the record, but I can tell you how that came about. What I'm trying to do is make the reward system based on their own success and their ability to acknowledge their own success and have this self-concept that is like, yeah, actually, I'm good at math. That's the reward. So I'm trying to plant that idea in their heads fundamentally, not, hey, I can do this and I'm doing it because I get some like digital coin for it or a limo ride. So it's got to be about making the penny drop for them. It's got to be about that feeling. They're going, oh, that buzz, like, that's what's going on. Okay, I've got it now. This makes it. I'm fine now. I got it. That's the reward system that I'm really interested in trying to tap into, the intrinsic reward system. And so it's about finding the right route in, right, making it probably relatively straightforward at the beginning, probably attempting a whole lot less than other programs might try to do. Like not going too big too quickly, because that first step is fundamental to then coming back and giving it another go. Like what we're trying to do with any basic skill that you need to do over and over again is make it not so much of a headache that you want to come back to it. So like my simple suggestion for any intervention is just go low key to start with. And sometimes when parents are coming to me saying my child is really struggling, it's because they're spending like 5 to 10 minutes at the kitchen table trying to sweat their child on whatever it is, like flashcards or times tables or addition, subtraction, whatever. And that's too much. They're metaphorically melting the kids. If their goodwill was like a candle, they're melting that candle too quickly. We just need to give them a dosage that they are content with, move on. So I'm just kind of like trying to use some psychology there, I suppose, some sense of the emotional state of the child and their goodwill. I've got a couple of boys of my own, plus all the kids that I've taught, just trying to pick up on reading the room, reading their emotions and not going beyond. Because what will happen is if I stress them out, next time I want to sit down with them and do some one-to-one maths, you know what they're going to do? It's like, no way. They're going to check out very quickly. So I've got to get in there just like the right temperament, the right amount of time, and really get that success level high. So look, with Rockstars, it's this theme that I didn't realize that just keeps on giving. And at the end of the first year of the program in my own school, I hired taxis for the students who had made the most progress. And these taxis, all they had to do was pick them up and bring the children to school to arrive all at the same time. So we could give them a big, like paparazzi kind of glorified welcome. And I had to explain to the taxi dispatcher, look, yes, I know the student lives 50 meters from the school gates, but can you just do a lap of the block? Just make them feel like a VIP. And so they would all arrive. The head teacher was there with his camera. We had a great time. I did that for 2 or 3 years and then thought, the idea occurred to me, well, how can we go bigger and better next time? And this time I thought, well, let's make this a multi-school competition. We'll get a whole load of schools in one place. Shout out to Bloomberg for hosting that first ever Rock Wrangle in 2014 in London and for giving us their offices. And the winner of that Rock Wrangle from across 50 different schools would get to ride in a limo across London to a heliport on the River Thames, where they would then have a joyride in a helicopter. Like I wanted them to have the Rock VIP treatment. Okay. I don't see boundaries or barriers. You know, I don't distinguish. I just like, if I have the idea, like I'm going for it. Sometimes the bigger, the better. You just got to do what you've got to do. So I thought limo plus helicopter equals VIP treatment. Not everybody got the chance to do that, obviously. Why not? Let's have life short. Like sometimes you've got to be silly, a little bit crazy, put a smile on people's faces, you know, whatever it takes.
Sounds fun. I wish you'd been my teacher. Do you ever think, by the way, though, that sometimes things like, do kids really want to practice? This is sort of an adult imposed thinking that adults think sometimes that practicing times tables and things like that seem boring and that it's going to turn people off math. And maybe it's just the way the adult thinks. Like something I really like about kids. Well, I like a lot of things about kids, but I teach adults. And when you teach adults, they come in with ideas in mind about math. And a lot of times they just don't like math. But the great thing I find about kids, like the kids that we have in our after school program, say in grade 4, is they all come in and they're just like, oh yeah, this is great. Math is fun. And you can do the most basic things. And you've got sort of this clean slate in front of you. So I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. And that energy is infectious. That's why I love being a teacher. It's why right now I'm missing the classroom so badly. And it's also why, like right now, my mission is to address this issue that we have of kids leaving school saying, I'm not good at maths. And that's why you end up with adults who don't buy into maths, who don't feel great about themselves, who have poor self-concept, as we might say in psychology. So what we've got to do is, while they're young, while they're forming that impression of themselves, kind of like between the age of 5 and 11, they're forming an impression of themselves in maths. Am I competent at maths? And the trouble is they're going to be comparing themselves to their peers. That's how they work out if they are or they're not. So I've got this opportunity to capture them before the cement sets, right? Before the concrete sets. And that's what we're doing with rock stars and with numbots, is to get them feeling good about themselves, have a positive self-concept, so that, like I've said before, when the maths gets harder, they stick with it. And we build them into kind of resilient young mathematicians. Now, to those adults who will say, well, I didn't need to learn times tables, or times tables aren't that important, that's a bit of a protection mechanism that they're using there to be like, okay, if I can say to myself times tables aren't important, then I can protect myself from not feeling great about my own times tables performance. And where I think that might come from is that what I like to think is that we're doing times table practice relatively well with rock stars. And I'm looking for all the ways we can improve it constantly. That's my day job, is to make it better. But I know that unfortunately, there's a lot of really bad practice when it comes to doing times tables learning, right? And that is potentially putting kids right off maths, stressing them out, not giving them a good experience, and going completely in the wrong direction. And so, yeah, those, surprise, surprise, they're going to grow up to be adults who don't feel great about times tables, don't feel great about maths, I'm not a maths person, all that kind of jazz. Rubbish. Like, all we've got to do is appreciate that there's best practice and bad practice, even when it comes to times tables. I worry that in many classrooms it's making the problem worse, not better. And so I hope that anybody listening is will find the joy factor in the times table practice. We'll try to make it easier, smaller, more contained, run with a program that's easy for them to manage, show the children their progress and their success, smile, right? But not do the things where we're calling individual names of children out in class and putting them on the spot and asking them a times table question. That's paralyzing to a number of children. And the ratio of people who are asking question, 1 to 29. One child thinking about the answer, 29 not. And it's also low frequency. You need to get each individual child doing their own private practice and be interested in today's score versus their score yesterday, knowing that what they're trying to do is be better than they were yesterday, but not better than the person sat next to them. So yeah, not calling kids out, not putting stuff up on the board, which is difficult to read, and putting a clock. I'm not saying we shouldn't have timed exercises and low stakes quizzes and whatnot. You shouldn't be trying to get as many correct in, say, 3 minutes as you can, but make it easy for them to do well. And don't make it kind of public when they might not, because there's a whole load of other emotions going in there. And that happens time and time again. You're going to, harden that cement much quicker. That negative math cement much, much quicker.
So you're not a fan of cold calling?
Oh, no, I'm not saying that. I would have them primed to be relatively successful. With times table facts and individual children, you run the risk of catching a child out. Of course, I developed the culture in my classroom. From day one, we're about positivity. We're about supporting mistakes. We're about being able to put our hand up or take a cold call question. We've got the right environment, the right culture, but it's still very isolating. It's like someone's just suddenly shone a spotlight on you, like a police interrogation. What is 7 times 9? And it feels like it's the kind of question that you have to be able to answer really quickly. And if you don't, then everyone, in slow motion, is kind of time stops and everybody's looking at you. I would use cold calling to kind of assess the classroom's level of understanding on something, or maybe use mini whiteboards and not take the risk that I might put someone on the spot. What I also don't want to do is ask the fast children for the question, because then everybody's going to, the ones who are not so fast are going to look at that child and be like, oh, I'm never going to be that person. And so we're also sending subliminal messages depending on who we ask which questions to. So I'm just, again, leaning into that psychology. Both my parents are psychologists too. My sister also studied psychology at Sheffield. So thinking about thinking is something I think about a lot.
I take your point, and I agree with you about being very careful about putting people on the spot. And the other thing you mentioned quite a bit, and I think this is really important, and the way that I think some other people describe it is the set size, keep your set size small. If you're trying to get someone to learn something and you're trying to build confidence, you want to keep your set size small. In other words, don't give too many problems for them to work on at once, because you do want them to experience success and not overwhelm them. I watched your video with the child doing the pencil pledge, and, so I'm going to play it.
Okay.
This is my pencil. This is my pencil. There are many like it. There are many like it. But this is my pencil. But this is my pencil. And I use it to do maths. So today is our day. So today is our day. To do more and be more. To do more and be more.
all about?
I like sometimes to change the energy in the room. And before we're about to set off on an independent task, something on a worksheet, piece of paper or whatever it might be, I just want the kids to feel like, okay, I'm ready for this. Let's do this. Like, I'm super pumped. And so this pencil pledge actually comes from, I think it's from Full Metal Jacket. Originally, it's more like, this is my rifle. And so it's just really like a battle cry to kind of get kids pumped for the thing that they're about to do. I don't use it every lesson, but I do like to do a whole bunch of different chants for different things. And it's a bit silly. It's a bit daft. The kids lead it. The kids are excited. I'm kind of excited. And off they go. We'll have a chance for knowledge. We'll have a chance for learning. All sorts of chants. Just sometimes a bit of noise and a bit of all-togetherness is what these kind of choral chants sometimes do for us. A bit of community building. A bit of culture. I would like to pay my respects, if you like, to all the charter schools that we visited, right? We're standing on the shoulders of giants who kind of, for me, led that way, that enthusiasm, really modeled that and continue to do so. So we're just kind of borrowing their great ideas, sometimes flexing on them.
So let's talk about Shanghai. I had Nick Gibb on the podcast, and he mentioned that there were these programs, these teacher exchanges with teachers in England and teachers in Shanghai. And I understand that you maybe took part in that.
Yes.
So can you tell us a bit about how that worked?
Credit to Nick Gibb. He was one of those ministers who took the time to look overseas, check out other jurisdictions, physically go there and find out what they were doing, speak to the right people, and came up with, he and his team and his advisors came up with this idea of a Shanghai teacher exchange, because they saw and understood there to be very effective practice that was leading to great outcomes on international education assessments, right? So I had the chance to go there just over a week. And then some of their teachers would come over to our schools and be it's a bit like a pen pal exchange kind of thing. They would drop into different schools and they would spend 2 weeks there, first of all, observing some lessons, but then also teaching a lot of lessons. They would kind of take over the lessons back in England. In terms of what I saw while I was there, it was pretty incredible. A number of different ways. The consistency across the city was quite remarkable, as in not just from one classroom to the next would you see the same thing being taught in largely the same way, if not identical. But you could go from one school to the next, and they would be at the same point in the textbook or the same point in the curriculum teaching it in the same way. Like, they really respected a sort of a body of knowledge about this is what to teach. Not only that, but this is how you teach it. And they had learned those methods and internalized those methods and were being watched in a good way, like observed, like they had a really collaborative way of going over to visit each other's teaching and then convening afterwards as a sort of a mini group and discussing. They were looking maybe for ways to refine the way that had been taught. So they're just kind of constantly just like, if the teaching was like some kind of a Renaissance marble statue, they were just kind of constantly like polishing it and finding for little ways that they could just smoothen an edge and make it even more refined practice. So the consistency across the city was incredible. But then mathematically, what changed my practice and improved my understanding of what I think is now better math teaching is they had very short sets of questions, of exercises. I thought they would be doing copious, like large volume sets of exercises, just kind of lots of practice. But that just shows my ignorance of what I thought it was going to be like more than anything else. Instead, the sets were quite short, but the questions were super carefully sequenced and didn't change much from one to the other. So what that meant was that what it was teasing out was the underlying construct. Not just can you kind of keep repeating this process, this procedure, this algorithm over and over again, but each time you do it, if we just change an element of it, we will then be able to discuss what's different or unique about each one and how it's led to a deeper understanding. So they're transmitting not only the kind of the practice, but also building up the conceptual understanding. I know you have a sort of bit of a difficulty with the idea of conceptual understanding, like what is it, but an appreciation, let's say, of the underlying constructs. So it wasn't just blind repetition of an algorithm or of a set of steps. It's what in England we started to call intelligent practice. Like it was practice that went deeper than just repetition. So to give you an example, one thing that really stood out was the number of times they got 0 or 1 or a fraction or a negative number into the permutation of questions. If they could get something to somehow cancel out and add up to 0, or if they could somehow make two things combine to make a 1, or if they could put in a fraction to show how this was going to be this was going to influence the process, or a negative number to show you how it was going to influence the outcome, then they would. Like, they thought, whoever wrote those questions thought very, very carefully about the journey through the set of questions. And that's what I found quite fascinating. And that's something I really care passionately about, is what I talk about. You'll always hear me banging that drum, whether it's on podcasts or at conferences, is that idea of a question set being able to really pull out the underlying constructs and shine a light on them. And to give it, at the time, I think I sort of was terming it minimally different questions, barely changing one thing from one question to the next. And then it turns out there's sort of a name for it, which is variation theory. Variation theory is more sophisticated than minimally different questions, but minimally different questions definitely play on what is known as variation theory. And what's happening with variation theory is that if you want students to attend to something, you keep as many things constant and only change the one thing that you want them to attend to. So they call it about having an invariant background, a background that doesn't change, but the thing you want them to focus on is that it's just the one thing that's changing. Let's say we're expanding brackets or multiplying out brackets. I don't know what you call it in North America, but 6 brackets, x minus 2, close brackets. What do you call that? Do you call that expanding brackets?
Mathematically, we call that the distributive property.
This is true. Yeah, mathematically, we call it that. But as an instruction to our students, we would say expand the brackets, or
expand and simplify.
Let's take 6 brackets, x minus 2. Some workbooks, some sheets that you can get from like Teachers Pay Teachers or wherever, they then might go on to the next question and change the number on the outside of the brackets, the letter, the variable inside, whether we're adding or taking away, and then the number. They might mix up the order. And the way they're basing their worksheet is, well, if I maximize the variation, the variability from one question to the next, then they're going to get maximum exposure to all these different things. So what we can say is, yes, they're going to get exposure to all these things, but what they'll never have the chance to do is to really deepen their understanding, because what our brains are trying to do is to look for patterns, look for meaning, to make sense of it. Otherwise, it just does become blind regurgitation or repetition of an algorithm. We can do so much better if we go carefully from one question to the next. So let's take 6 brackets x minus 2. What could we do to just change one thing? Well, we could check what happens if we change it to a 5 on the outside of the brackets. Does that change much? What happens there? What about if we did x minus a 6th inside the brackets? This is something that you'll probably come up in Shanghai, to my point about anything to make a 1. So when you multiply the 6 by the 6th, you get a 1. It's just showing the students that even if we've got a fraction inside the brackets, we're still multiplying across all the terms inside the brackets. And it just so happens that sometimes it's going to make a whole number. What happens if we put a negative 6 on the outside of the bracket? Then we've got to multiply a negative by a negative. And so we've got to show that, that works too. By changing one thing at a time, we're really broadening the limits of the students' understanding, because they're able to see those patterns. We're able to talk about those patterns. We're able to talk about what's important and what isn't. What wouldn't change it? The process is identical every time, but just sometimes there are just little nuances, things that we're going to have to think about. And then we can start to do 2 brackets, and we can start to change the order inside the brackets. But let's take one thing at a time and work with that, and then move on. So this is where a skilled teacher would do in their planning what I used to call atomizing, like breaking this learning intention, this objective down into all the constituent atoms, the pieces that will then combine together to make a really robust understanding of that topic or that learning objective. And we're going to have to approach them sequentially. We're going to have to work out like what's the easiest, and then how do we get to the ultimate one? How do we package it all back together? And often that doesn't fit inside one lesson. If we want to teach expanding brackets, we're going to need to plan, because the lesson length is kind of arbitrary. We're going to have to plan whatever it takes, the number of lessons it's going to take to cover that. It might take 2 lessons or 3 lessons to really go into the depth that we need.
And by the way, that's precisely how I would try to teach a new skill. Start with something and I would just change it slightly and keep going, and you build it up. You mentioned conceptual understanding. I just want to make something very clear, because I'm not against conceptual understanding. I just think nobody has a good definition for what it means. And so you're talking about this, and you mentioned building understanding. And so from what I'm taking, what you're thinking it means is that the student understands that you can use this this skill in many different ways, that it works in these different situations, that there's sort of like this flexibility of thinking. But lots of times that's not what people mean by conceptual understanding. They might mean something like, can you solve a problem in 5 different ways? They might mean, can you represent this using pictures? My issue with it is that there isn't a fixed definition. So I just want to make that clear. Of course, I want kids to understand math. I just think we're often not clear about what it means.
You're spot on. And I knew that about you, and that was me not articulating better. I know that it's more about how people interpret it and the different ways that people interpret it that you're picking up on, not that you don't believe in it in itself. Of course not.
I love what you're talking about, the variation theory. And I have never seen a textbook do that well. Have you?
Back in the day. Yeah. Pretty sure the textbooks that I was using when I was at school in the 80s and 90s. And I know there are some educators who have been around a long time as well who will point back to some of those textbooks and say, I wish we could bring those back. I think anybody who wants to scrutinize a modern textbook will find actually authors are not using those strategies these days.
Well, Bruno, I think a lot of people would consider that rote. I mean, it's like the problems don't seem to look very different, even though they actually are. But like, let's think about the gift that we're giving the student when we do that, though. We're doing that thing where they experience success. We're just changing one small thing.
That's it. It lightens the cognitive load.
Exactly. And it brings them, we're going to get them to the point where they can solve a really difficult problem. We're going to get them to the point where, you're talking about, you actually just had the distributive law with a constant outside, but we're going to get them to the point where they can actually multiply, 2 polynomials of any size.
Yeah, exactly. That's it.
But you do it incrementally. And then before you know it, the students can do this and they're like, wow, I can do this. Whereas when you just start giving these really difficult problems from the get-go and you're not building them up, it's really confusing for students.
Precisely. And that consistency from one question to the next also means that their brain is still keeping some of it in its buffer, and all they've got to do is deal with the one thing that's changed kind of thing. If they've done the heavy lifting on 4 times 7 or something, they're not going to need to redo that. If 4 and 7 are still in the next question, they just need to do the bit that's changed. Does that make sense? Like it's still hanging around in the RAM or whatever in the cache.
Unfortunately, it takes a lot of time to plan those kinds of problems.
But now with the likes of generative LLMs, there's nothing to stop anybody who's kind of making their own stuff to say, hey, look, chat, Claude, or whoever you're using, make sure that, there's kind of minimal difference between them, or use variation theory to help. We're in a great place now to be able to use generative AI to do kind of better jobs of worksheets and stuff.
That's something you noticed they were doing in Shanghai then?
Yes, the 0, 1, fractions and negatives, because they provide some of the most interesting curveballs and edge cases when we work with them. Sometimes 0 was in the question or 1 was in the question. Sometimes 1 or 0 was in the solution, but it just kind of changed something. Like where you ended up with x squared minus 2 plus 2. The minus 2 and plus 2 kind of cancel each other out in the end, and so you're left with x squared. Just to show that there's another case where sometimes the 2 constants add up to 0 kind of thing. So just little things like that they would always try to do.
Were they using textbooks?
Yes, definitely. 100%, yeah.
Those textbooks that are used in Shanghai, could you bring them to England? Translate? And
we did try. There was a whole project to try and translate them. I think it would involve expert use of them. It would involve changing the curriculum. There were a number of other things that would need to change, but there was an ambition to just simply translate them. And it's not that straightforward.
And I think the other thing I've heard you talk about quite a bit is mastery learning. Is that something that they were doing in Shanghai as well?
I think so. Like, again, mastery to me is a bit like how people talk about understanding concepts to you, as in lots of people describe it in lots of different ways. I just sort of paraphrase it as properly learning, because there was a time before we started using mastery learning when I don't think we were getting kids to properly learn the maths. We were skating over it. We were like just going through lesson by lesson really quickly, hastily just getting them to reperform the algorithms, the procedures or whatever. And we were saying that was enough. It was very performance driven. I don't think that's proper learning. And I think proper learning is what people would call mastery learning, as in they can do the thing that we've shown them to do and be successful in it, but they they also kind of have a greater, more rounded picture of the maths that they're doing, why that algorithm maybe works, when to use it, how to use it in a novel problem. Just a greater depth level of appreciation, understanding, greater flexibility, because more time has been spent on it, more care has been put into the lessons, the crafting the lessons and the sequence of things and the breaking up of things in order to achieve that level of proper learning. To me, that's mastery learning, like getting it for life, like properly understanding, like, oh, I get it. That's mastery learning.
How did you implement mastery learning in your school when you were at King Solomon?
First year I didn't, and it was from the second year onwards that people would start to sort of label what I was doing as mastery learning. And it simply came from slowing the curriculum down. In the first year, I took a curriculum off the shelf. I didn't know better. I'd only done 2 years of teaching when we founded King Solomon Academy, so I knew absolutely nothing about writing a curriculum. So I just took one off the shelf, essentially, and it just moved the children on too quickly. Like every 2 weeks, we'd be doing a new topic, and that's not enough to really move them forward. If they were already starting from behind, then maybe over the course of those 2 weeks, I'd bring them back up to a baseline level of knowledge for their age group. And then come Monday, I'd be starting them on a brand new topic. So they're back to square one again on this new topic. So instead, I thought, look, there's got to be another way to do this. And I remembered programs like Saved by the Bell and other high school math, like programs at US high schools where kids would say, right, I'm going off to algebra class. I'm going off to geometry class, which made me think, so in America, they do like a whole year of algebra and they just go to this class that's dedicated to algebra. It's like, maybe we could do something like that because they must have gone into a lot of depth in those classes. So I thought, okay, well, look, England's isn't ready for an entire year of calling this algebra class. No one will ever stomach that. How about if I just do like a half term? So we'll have a whole 6 or 7 weeks dedicated to algebra. We'll have 6 or 7 weeks dedicated to geometry. We'll have 6 or 7 weeks dedicated to fractions. And I think we're probably going to need 14 weeks dedicated to like number skills at the start of grade 6. And so I did that. I just went slower. And that just meant that we could build up the skills, go so much deeper, like really work on that understanding, revisit stuff, do some more tangential off-piste stuff that we'd never get the chance to, but now we're really kind of getting to grips with it and just kind of getting excited about it. I would lay out the half term, so which is like 6 or 7 weeks usually in England, as follows. First 5 weeks predominantly would be, well, what I would now call explicit instruction. I didn't at the time. I didn't have a name for it. It was just like, hey, I'm going to teach for 5 weeks. I'm going to teach these objectives that I've carefully mapped out based on the days that I've got available. And in the last week of the term, we're going to be a lot more, we're going to go to do some problem solving, some much richer stuff. We're just going to slow right down. We're not going to be going through something brand new. We're going to be kind of really using what we've been learning. We're going to lean into group activities.
Just to recap on that. So around 5 or 6 weeks, well, it's got to depend on the topic, how much time you need on the explicit instruction and mastery. I really think it's best to think of it in terms of the instructional hierarchy. Have the students achieve fluency, which it sounds to me like that's what you were doing. So on average, let's say about 5 or 6 weeks on the explicit instruction, achieving mastery, and then you're doing 1 week on the upper part of the instructional hierarchy, the generalization, adaptation stage. That's when you're bringing in the things like the group work and problem solving.
But not until then. And if you're going to do group work, you can't just do group work with any activity. Like it has to be a group worthy problem. That's actually quite important. There are some activities that lend themselves well to being done together as a group, and there are some that aren't. So you've got to figure that out. And each student in the group should have a particular role, and those roles should change. And we did a whole lot of work just on group work. I would have students sat on high chairs around the groups, observing the groups, would have talked already about what it means to do group work well, and then we would feedback on how well we're doing the group work.
So we're not eliminating the generalization adaptation stage, but the other piece can be fun too. That's the other thing. I think people think that the build up, the mastery piece is like boring, but I don't think that's the case.
Oh no, that's the kind of the bit that I miss the most, because that's like the electrifying bit for me in the lessons is just the penny dropping when they're like, yes, I get it. Like for me, that's just the biggest reward in life is to hear that. My lessons were relatively high paced in the sense that there were lots of questions kind of going back and forth, quite dynamic, and I got a real kick out of that because it was a real chance for them to their thoughts and their questions and to bounce ideas and for that learning to be really intensified. So no, to me, explicit instruction is quite high octane. You're not doing it if the pace feels slow. in a sense that it should be like routinely checking for understanding. Now we're going to do a little bit of a demo, and now I'm going to get you to, I want to make sure that you've understood that demo. Now you're going to do different ways. Now you're going to practice, have a go at that. And then we're going to check that we've got it all. And then we're going to move on and up tempo, a lot of fun.
I guess there was one other thing actually I wanted to ask about Shanghai. Were those kids doing a lot of after school work, like a lot of after school tutoring and things like that?
I'll never know for sure, because I didn't obviously see them or witness them, but that's what I'm told, is that they will make up, if they haven't understood it, that the families feel, I'm not going to let my child fall behind. And these weren't necessarily well-to-do families, but education is put on, is held in such high standing in China in general that families of all standings and all levels of their own individual educational backgrounds would find the resources to make sure their child had the input that they needed to get to higher levels of education.
That happens here in Canada as well, but it's just the families that can afford it. So that's why we have to make sure we get it right in school. So that's why we're having all these conversations.
For sure.
What do you think most math programs get wrong when it comes to helping students achieve fluency?
I think they might be, the problem set might be too big. So let's start with something smaller. Let's think about how the kids are going to feel, and are they going to have fun? Is there a bit of color? It doesn't have to be literally color, but is there just something that's just going to bring a bit of a smile? Is it clear to the student that they are improving? Is it low stakes? Or does it feel high stakes? It should feel low stakes is what we want. It should feel normal. It should be, this is what we're doing. We're doing it every day. It's kind of completely normal. It's just the way we do things. And I think what would be, in my mind, ideal is that all the students are doing the same thing, not different students doing different things. Because at least in my classroom, the culture that I want, particularly at the start of the lesson, that's generally when we're doing that fact practice, is for them to feel at the start of the lesson that we're all on the same page. No matter whether later on different students end up getting different questions somehow or get further than me, whatever. What I don't want to do is start my lesson with different children thinking, oh, well, that table or that individual, they've got a different sheet from me. What does that say about me and my maths? We don't need to start any lesson feeling like that. That's just not a fun way to start. And then it just comes back to kind of drying that cement more quickly. So I think about that. Are you asking the teachers to do different things with different children? Because if you are, you're also creating extra workload for teachers. You're asking them to mark and assess different outputs. And that's time consuming for teachers. And we know that teachers are time poor. And it might not be necessary. It might not be necessary for that level of personalization unless they're doing it online, unless the online system is doing that personalization for them.
On that topic, fluency, you have a times table test in England. How's that going in your mind? It's 9-year-olds?
Yeah, I think grade 3. Does that sound like age 9 to you? Yeah, there could be 9, it could be 10, I don't know. And they have 25 questions. They have a 6-second time limit to answer each question. They're all multiplication. There's no division questions. And they're taken from a subset or weighted across the different tables. So fewer questions from the 2s and the 10s, more questions slightly from the 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s, 12s. And it's not a perfect assessment. No assessment ever is. It's an assessment. It has mobilized the entire teaching workforce in primary schools around times tables and fact fluency. So it's had huge ripple effects, not just in multiplication division, and not just in the recall. It's spilled over into that understanding piece and the conceptual piece, bringing out arrays, bringing out diagrams, bar models, physical blocks, whatever it takes to help children really piece together, understand commutativity or distributive properties and things like that. Teachers haven't just stopped short and done what the test is going to test the children on. They've gone way beyond, which is awesome. So the children are coming out with much more rounded knowledge of the tables because it's really put times tables back on the map. It's also then had a spillover into addition and subtraction and number bonds, which it was never designed to do. And we don't have a test for addition, subtraction, and number bonds. But it means that with the success that they've seen from doing great work in times tables, teachers are now applying those same strategies to addition, subtraction, number bonds and realizing the importance of those. What they're not then doing yet, but a number of teachers are kind of realizing, but after the test, the years after the test, at the moment, not enough schools are maintaining that skill level. They're letting it drop off again. And unsurprisingly, the times table recall then fades away, and you try and get some students in year 5 and year 6 to do some mental arithmetic, and they can't recall the tables the way they could in year 4. So they need to be better at entering a maintenance mode, if you like, in year 5 and year 6 to kind of keep those backgrounds, factual recall, ticking along.
They shouldn't really disappear. Like if you know it, it should be maintained. Like most of the skills we use in math are going to require recall of times tables. I find that a little bit odd.
Like the frequency just massively drops off, right, when they're doing the maths. You know, they're just not going to come across 6 times 7 half as frequent as they were when they were practicing it every day. And so just 1 or 2 facts will kind of it's not they've forgotten them completely. It's just going to take them like 5 or 6 seconds to record instead of 2 or 3. You know, they'll get, but they're not using them. But that's not fair on all the schools who have realized that maintenance mode is necessary. There are thousands of those schools who are doing that, which is great. It's here to stay for a while. If the government came knocking and said, how would you amend the test? You know, I've got some ideas, but they haven't come knocking yet. So we'll wait. I would say that we run the biggest mock test outside of the official one. We've just finished today 200,000 students. That's a quarter of the students who are going to do the real thing have been through our mock assessment. They've been able to compare that with a national average and a local authority average. So they've got a very good sense going into June with the real thing of where their students are at. And I've looked at that data and I can see how well they're doing. And I can say that each year it's going up, which means that teachers are getting more savvy about what needs to be done each year.
I'll sort of end with this question. These can be complicated issues. And you say you think a lot about psychology and how people think, because both your parents were psychologists, your sister's a psychologist, you have 2 psychology degrees. What are some ways that you try to convince people about the importance of things like learning times tables?
I think just pausing to understand like what the other side of the argument is and where it's maybe really coming from. Sometimes some things are projected like, well, not everybody needs to learn the tables. Like I'm great at maths, or I'm a professor of maths or whatever, and I didn't need to learn the tables, or can't kids just use calculators? If I just took that question at its surface level, I would think I would miss really where they were coming from and how they had got in their mind to asking that question. So I really tried to unpick that, see the other side. Sometimes the differences between us might be as fundamental as a difference in what we view education as being for. And that's why different people come up with different ways of going about instruction and what's important, because they think, well, education, it serves this purpose, and I might think that education serves that purpose. And we're going to probably have to agree to disagree or respect one another's ideologies and move forward. What I do find very distracting on the social media, and I think all the other teachers kind of listening in on these conversations, are when they're made to be very polarized. And actually what we can do is do a greater job for the greater good of the education sector and make it easier to find a joint way forward. It's just listen to the other side and kind of be quite respectful and be like, okay, but I see you there. I'll meet you on that point. That kind of makes a lot of sense. Let's just be reasonable with each other. But quite often these things on social media can be played out in such an unreasonable way. And that's not helpful. And it's time consuming, and it's been going on for decades. And like, come on guys, like it's 2025. We don't need to be like full on arguing about this still and rehashing these things and trading myths. We should be able to agree, and we should probably respect the fact that we agree on more than we disagree on, and move forward together diplomatically. Life is short.
Okay, Bruno, thank you so much for coming on today and talking to me. It's been a real pleasure. I've followed your work for quite a while, so it's been a pleasure to talk to you and for you to share your work with us. So thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Let's catch up soon.
As always, we've included a resource page that has links to articles and books mentioned in the episode. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider showing your support by leaving a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Chalk and Talk is produced by me, Anna Stokke. Transcript and resource page by Jasmine Boisclair and Deepika Tung. Subscribe on your favorite podcast app to get new episodes delivered as they become available. You can follow me on X, Blue Sky, or LinkedIn for notifications, or check out my website, annastokke.com, for more information. This podcast received funding through a University of Winnipeg Knowledge Mobilization and Community Impact Grant funded through the Anthony Swady Knowledge Impact Fund.